The rain fell hard that night, drumming against the windows of the university computer lab. It was nearly 2 a.m. and the campus was quiet except for the soft tapping of keyboard keys. In the dim blue light of the computer screen sat a young black teen, his eyes focused intently on lines of code that scrolled across the monitor. This was Andra, just 16 years old, with a mind that worked in ways few people around him understood. Andra glanced nervously at his watch. He still had about an hour before he needed to catch the last night bus back to his neighborhood. His fingers moved quickly across the keyboard, racing against time to finish the algorithm he'd been working on for weeks. The university's powerful computers were the only ones that could handle the complex calculations his project required. He hadn't planned to become a regular visitor to this lab. It started 3 months ago when he'd helped the janitor, Mr. Wilson, fix his phone. The grateful older man had noticed Andrew's interest in computers and started letting him in after hours. "Just don't touch nothing you ain't supposed to," Mr. Wilson had warned with a kind smile. "And make sure you're gone before the morning shift arrives." But tonight, Mr. Wilson was homesick. The replacement security guard was doing his rounds when he spotted the light from the computer lab. When he found Andra inside, the guard didn't wait for explanations. Within minutes, campus police arrived, followed by city officers. "How'd you get in here?" demanded an officer, his flashlight beam pointed directly at Andra's face. "Sir, I can explain," Andra began, his voice soft but steady. He reached for his backpack to show the permission note Mr. Wilson had written him. "Hands where I can see them," the officer shouted, one hand moving to his holster. Andra froze, his heart pounding. He slowly raised his hands, eyes wide with fear. "I have permission to be here," he tried again. The officer scoffed. "Yeah, right. You expect me to believe that?" They didn't let him finish saving his work. They didn't call Mr. Wilson to verify his story. Instead, they handcuffed him and led him through the rain to the police car, watched by curious students who had been awakened by the commotion. At the station, Andra sat alone in a cold room for hours. His threadbare hoodie, soaked from the rain, provided little warmth. He thought about his mom, who would be waking up soon for her early hospital cleaning shift. She'd be terrified when she found him missing from their small apartment. When they'd finally let him make a call, his mom's voice cracked with worry. "Baby, what happened?" "They think I'd broke into the university," Andrew explained quietly. "They're saying I was trying to steal computers or something." He heard his mother sigh, that deep, weary sigh he'd come to recognize whenever the world treated them unfairly. "I'll try to get off work," she said. "No, Mom, you can't miss a shift. We need the money for rent." Andrew tried to sound stronger than he felt. "They're taking me to court in the morning. Just a hearing. I'll explain everything to the judge." But as dawn broke and Andrew was transferred to the courthouse holding room, the knot in his stomach tightened. He'd heard stories about Judge Harrington. People called him the Hammer because of how hard he came down on kids from neighborhoods like Andrew's. The court-appointed lawyer who met with Andrew barely looked at him. The man flipped through his file for maybe 3 minutes before closing it with a snap. "Trespassing and unauthorized computer access," the lawyer said flatly. "First offense, we'll ask for community service. Don't speak unless the judge asks you a direct question, and look respectful." Andrew nodded, though inside he wanted to scream that he hadn't done anything wrong. That the code he was working on could help translate medical instructions for people who couldn't read well, like his grandmother who had missed taking her heart medication because she couldn't understand the directions. As he waited for his case to be called, Andrew rehearsed what he would say if given the chance. But when he finally stepped into the grand courtroom with its high ceilings and wooden benches, the words dried up in his throat. Sitting high on the bench, looking down at him with cold eyes, was Judge Harrington, a man who had already decided who and what Andrew was before he even opened his mouth. The real Andrew, the self-taught genius who had learned coding from outdated library books and free Wi-Fi, disappeared. In his place stood just another black teen from the east side, exactly what the judge expected to see. The courtroom buzzed with morning activity. Lawyers shuffled papers, clerks whispered to each other, and officers led a stream of people to their places. Andrew sat on a hard wooden bench, trying to make himself as small as possible. His stomach growled. He hadn't eaten since yesterday's lunch at school. The handcuffs had been removed, but the feeling of cold metal still lingered on his wrists. Case number 47,293, juvenile defendant Andrew Taylor, charges of trespassing and unauthorized computer access. Andrew's legs felt like lead as he walked to the front of the courtroom. His court-appointed lawyer, a tired-looking man with coffee stains on his tie, barely acknowledged him. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, making Andrew's already throbbing headache worse. Judge Harrington looked down from his bench, squinting over reading glasses. The judge was in his 60s, with silver hair and deep lines around his mouth that seemed permanently turned downward. His courtroom was known for quick judgments and harsh sentences. "Stand up straight," the judge barked, causing Andrew to flinch. "Do you have any respect for these proceedings at all?" Andrew straightened his posture, keeping his eyes lowered, something his uncle had taught him when dealing with authority figures. Look them in the eye, and they think you're challenging them. Look down, and they think you're hiding something. Can't win either way, his uncle had said. "Look at me when I'm speaking to you, young man," the judge demanded, his voice echoing through the courtroom. Andrew slowly raised his eyes, meeting the judge's stern gaze. The courtroom felt impossibly large in that moment, filled with strangers watching his humiliation. "Another one from Eastside High," Judge Harrington said with a sigh, flipping through the case file. "Do they teach anything at that school besides how to get into trouble?" A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom. Andrew's face burned with shame. "Your Honor," began the public defender half-heartedly, "my client has no prior record." "I can read, counsel," the judge interrupted, tapping the file. "That doesn't explain why he was breaking into university property at 2 in the morning. What were you after, boy? Computer equipment to sell, or just enjoying vandalizing places that are trying to educate people?" Andrew opened his mouth to explain, but only a whisper came out. His throat had closed up from nervousness. "Speak up. This isn't a library," Judge Harrington snapped, leaning forward. "I wasn't stealing anything, sir," Andrew finally managed, his voice cracking slightly. The judge made a show of cupping his ear. "What was that? Is mumbling part of the curriculum at your school too?" More laughter from the audience. A bailiff smirked. Andrew's lawyer shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. "I was working on a program," Andrew said, his voice stronger this time. "A program?" Judge Harrington repeated, eyebrows raised in exaggerated disbelief. "What kind of program requires breaking into university property in the middle of the night? A program to hack bank accounts? To steal identities?" "No, sir, it's for medical translations." The judge laughed outright. "Medical translations? Do you expect this court to believe that a high school student from East Side, no less, is developing medical software?" He turned to the prosecutor. "What's next? Is he going to tell us he's performing brain surgery on weekends?" The prosecutor smiled obligingly. The public defender checked his watch. Andrew felt something shift inside him. All the nights studying alone, teaching himself from outdated library books, working the evening shift at the corner store to save for his own computer, all of it dismissed with a joke. "May I explain, Your Honor?" Andrew asked, surprising even himself with his steady voice. "Oh, this should be entertaining," Judge Harrington said, settling back in his chair with a theatrical gesture. "Please, enlighten the court about your medical software." Andrew took a deep breath. "My grandmother can't read English very well. She missed taking her heart medicine because she couldn't understand the instructions. She almost died." He paused, swallowing hard at the memory. "I'm building a program that takes medical instructions and translates them into simple language and pictures. It works for different languages too." For a moment, the judge seemed caught off guard by the sincerity in Andrew's voice, but he quickly recovered his mocking tone. "And I suppose the university just happened to invite you to use their computers for this charitable work? In the middle of the night?" Andrew looked down again. "No, sir." "No, indeed," the judge said, his voice hardening. "You broke in, you stole access, and now you're wasting this court's time with fairy tales." The public defender finally stirred. "Your Honor, if I may request a brief recess to confer with my client." "Denied," Judge Harrington cut him off. "I have a full docket today, and I won't have it delayed by." The courtroom doors suddenly opened, and a woman in a crisp lab coat walked in, followed by an older man in work overalls. The unexpected interruption caused the judge to pause mid-sentence, his face darkening with annoyance as all eyes turned to the newcomers. The courtroom fell silent as the woman in the lab coat strode confidently toward the front. She was Asian, maybe in her 40s, with short practical hair and intelligent eyes behind slim glasses. The older man following her was black, with gray speckled hair and wearing a janitor's uniform with university maintenance stitched on the pocket. Judge Harrington's face tightened with irritation. "This is a closed proceeding. If you're not on the docket, you'll need to wait outside." The woman wasn't intimidated. Dr. Lally Chen, head of computer science at the university. "Your Honor, I'm here regarding this case." Her voice was firm and carried authority. Andrew's eyes widened in surprise. He recognized her name from research papers he'd studied online, but they'd never met. Why would the head of computer science come to this hearing? The judge's annoyance was clear. "Doctor, we have procedures. You can't simply walk in." "I apologize for the interruption," Dr. Chen said, not sounding very apologetic, "but this is time-sensitive. This young man was arrested at my department's facilities last night." "Yes, for trespassing," the judge replied sharply, "which is precisely what we're addressing." The older man in the maintenance uniform stepped forward. "Your Honor, I'm Robert Wilson, night security at the university labs." "There's been a misunderstanding." The judge's eyebrows shot up. "Court officer, please remove these people unless they've been called as witnesses." Andrew's public defender suddenly perked up, sensing an opportunity. "Your Honor, I'd like to call both these individuals as witnesses for the defense." Judge Harrington looked like he'd bitten into something sour. "This is highly irregular, counsel." "So is rushing to judgment without all the facts," Dr. Chen said coolly. A murmur ran through the courtroom. People who'd been half asleep moments before were now sitting forward, curious about the drama unfolding. The judge banged his gavel. "Order." "Fine, we'll hear the witnesses." He glared at Andrew's lawyer. "But this better not be a waste of the court's time." Mr. Wilson was sworn in first. He nervously cleared his throat, hands clasped in front of him. "I've known this young man for about 4 months now. First met him when my phone went haywire. Couldn't figure it out. He fixed it in 2 minutes, showed me what happened and even how to prevent it from happening again." "Is fixing a phone supposed to impress this court?" The judge interrupted. "No, sir, but what happened after might?" Mr. Wilson continued. "I noticed him hanging around the computer lab windows after his evening shift at the grocery store. Just looking in, never causing trouble. One day, I asked him what he was interested in. He told me about this medical program he was working on, showed me sketches of it on paper, all these complex flowcharts and code he'd written by hand because he didn't have a computer powerful enough." Judge Harrington tapped his fingers impatiently. "And you decided to let him use university equipment without authorization?" Mr. Wilson straightened his shoulders. "Yes, sir, I did. Been working at that university for 22 years. Never broken a rule. But this kid, the way his eyes lit up talking about helping people like his grandmother, I couldn't say no. So I let him in after hours when nobody was using those computers anyway. He always left everything exactly as he found it. Never caused a problem until last night when I was out sick and the replacement guard found him." The judge turned to Dr. Chen, who had been sworn in. "And your interest in this case, Doctor?" Dr. Chen opened her laptop. "For the past 3 months, our department has been tracking an anonymous user who's been uploading remarkably sophisticated code to our research servers. The code included groundbreaking algorithms for natural language processing specifically designed for medical terminology. We've been trying to identify the creator." She turned the laptop around, showing complex diagrams and code. "This work rivals that of our doctoral candidates. When security reported the arrest, I checked the lab logs. The computer where Andrew was working matches the source of these uploads." Andrew stared at his shoes, feeling everyone's eyes on him. He hadn't meant for anyone to discover his late-night work. He'd just been using a tiny corner of the university's computing power when nobody needed it. "You expect me to believe that this high school student created graduate-level computer algorithms?" Judge Harrington looked incredulous. "I don't expect you to believe anything without evidence, Your Honor," Dr. Chen replied. She handed a flash drive to the court clerk. This contains both the uploaded work and the projects recovered from the computer Andrew was using last night. Our department has verified they were created by the same person. The coding style is identical. She looked directly at Andrew. When I realized it was a teenager who'd created this work, I came immediately. This young man isn't a criminal. He's potentially one of the most gifted natural programmers I've encountered in my 20-year career. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Andrew's public defender was now sitting up straight, suddenly invested in the case. The prosecutor was flipping through papers, looking confused. Judge Harrington's face had turned an interesting shade of red. Judge Harrington cleared his throat, adjusting his robe as he tried to regain his composure. The courtroom remained unusually quiet, everyone waiting to see what would happen next. Andrew kept his eyes down, uncomfortable with all the attention suddenly focused on him. "These claims are extraordinary," the judge finally said, his tone more measured than before. "But this court deals in facts, not extraordinary claims. Do you have any actual proof that this young man created this supposedly revolutionary work?" Dr. Chen nodded confidently. "I thought you might ask that, Your Honor." She turned to Andrew. "Would you mind showing us your process? Just explain one portion of your algorithm to the court." Andrew looked up, panic flashing across his face. Speaking in front of all these people was his worst nightmare. He glanced at Mr. Wilson, who gave him an encouraging nod. "Your Honor." Andrew's lawyer jumped in, finally seeing a chance to be useful. "My client is clearly uncomfortable with public speaking, which explains his earlier reticence. Perhaps Dr. Chen could ask him specific technical questions that would demonstrate his knowledge." The judge considered this. "Very well. Proceed, Doctor." Dr. Chen approached Andrew and spoke gently. "The transitional matrix you used in the language processing module, can you explain why you chose that particular approach?" The courtroom watched as Andrew took a deep breath. When he began speaking, his voice was quiet but grew stronger with each word. "The traditional Markov chains most people use for language processing don't work well for medical terminology when you're dealing with patients who have limited literacy. They produce technically correct translations that still confuse people." Andrew's hands began to move as he explained, his passion overcoming his nervousness. "I created a modified matrix that weighs medical terms against common usage and cultural contexts. It generates instructions that sound natural to people who speak different dialects or have different educational backgrounds." Dr. Chen nodded encouragingly. "And the visual component?" "That was harder," Andrew admitted. "I had to design a system that creates simple but accurate images for each medication instruction. Like if the prescription says take with food, it doesn't just show a generic food icon. It learns what foods the patient actually eats based on their input and shows those specific foods." As Andrew continued explaining, using terms like adaptive learning algorithms and cultural contextual processing, the judge's expression shifted from skepticism to astonishment. Even the prosecutor was listening intently, his notes forgotten. "Where did you learn all this?" Judge Harrington interrupted, genuine curiosity replacing his earlier condescension. Andrew shrugged slightly. "Library books at first. Then online tutorials whenever I could use the public library computers. Our school doesn't have computer science classes, so I mostly taught myself." Dr. Chen stepped forward again. "Your Honor, what Andrew has created would normally require a team of graduate students and professors. He did it alone, with limited resources, and with a clear purpose of helping others. The university isn't interested in pressing charges. In fact, we'd like to offer Andrew access to our facilities, officially this time, to continue his work." The judge removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. The courtroom remained silent, the usual shuffling and whispering completely absent. Everyone was captivated by the unfolding story of the teen genius nobody had noticed. "Mr. Wilson," the judge addressed the security guard, "why didn't you simply help this young man get official permission to use the facilities?" Mr. Wilson shifted uncomfortably. "I suggested it, Your Honor." But Andrew was worried no one would take him seriously, that they'd think someone like him couldn't possibly be doing this kind of work. He paused, looking directly at the judge. "And based on how he was treated when they found him, and even here today before Dr. Chen arrived, I'd say his concerns weren't unfounded." The judge's face flushed slightly at the implied criticism. He turned to the prosecutor. Does the state wish to continue with these charges? The prosecutor, sensing which way the wind was blowing, quickly gathered his papers. Given the circumstances and the university's position, the state will drop all charges, Your Honor. Judge Harrington nodded. Case dismissed. He banged his gavel, then hesitated, looking at Andrew with new eyes. Young man, before you leave, I'd like to hear more about this program of yours. What inspired you to create it? For the first time that day, Andrew looked directly at the judge without fear. My grandmother nearly died because she couldn't understand her medication instructions. She's not the only one. Lots of people in my neighborhood have the same problem. Elderly folks, immigrants, people who didn't get much schooling. They're smart, but the system isn't designed for them. His voice grew more confident. I figured if I could build something to help my grandmother, it could help others too. The judge was silent for a moment, genuinely moved. That's quite commendable. Dr. Chen smiled. And that's why the university is interested. Andrew's approach is unique because it comes from a place of real understanding and empathy. He's solving problems most of our researchers haven't even recognized because they haven't experienced them. As the reality of the situation sank in, whispers spread through the courtroom. The same people who had laughed at Andrew earlier now looked at him with amazement and respect. The judge, clearly wrestling with his conscience, finally spoke again. This court stands adjourned. Andrew, Dr. Chen, Mr. Wilson, would you please meet me in my chambers? I believe we have some matters to discuss. Judge Harrington's chambers were nothing like the Stark courtroom. Warm wood paneling covered the walls, and leather-bound law books filled the shelves. Framed diplomas and family photos created a more human atmosphere than the cold authority of the courtroom. Andrew sat stiffly on the edge of a leather chair, still not quite believing the turn of events. Just an hour ago, he'd been facing criminal charges and the judge's mockery. Now that same judge was offering him coffee, which Andrew politely declined. I owe you an apology, Judge Harrington said, surprising everyone in the room. He removed his black robe and hung it on a coat rack, suddenly looking more like an ordinary older man in a suit than the intimidating figure from the bench. I made assumptions about you based on things I shouldn't have. Andrew nodded slightly but remained quiet. A lifetime of caution around authority figures didn't disappear in an instant. Dr. Chen spoke up. Your Honor, what matters now is what happens next. Andrew has exceptional talent that's being wasted. Our university would like to offer him a special arrangement. She turned to Andrew. We want to give you official access to our facilities and computing resources. More importantly, we'd like to connect you with mentors who can guide your development of the medical translation program. Andrew's eyes widened. Really? You let me keep working on it? Keep working on it? We want to help you expand it, Dr. Chen smiled. The potential applications could help thousands of people, but there's more. Mr. Wilson was grinning now. Tell him the rest, Doc. Dr. Chen's eyes sparked with excitement. Our department would like to offer you early admission to our computer science program. Full scholarship. Andrew's mouth fell open. College had always seemed like an impossible dream given his family's financial situation. But I'm only 16. I haven't even finished high school. That's where I might be able to help, Judge Harrington said, leaning forward. I sit on the Board of Education. We could arrange for you to complete your high school requirements while simultaneously beginning university coursework. The judge looked genuinely regretful as he continued. And what happened in my courtroom today? The way I spoke to you, the assumptions I made, that was wrong. But it's also sadly common. Too many bright young minds get overlooked or dismissed because of where they come from or how they look. Andrew found his voice. Sir, with respect, it's not just about being overlooked. At my school, we don't even have working computers most days. Our textbooks are 10 years old. How are kids supposed to learn advanced stuff when the basics aren't even available? The judge nodded slowly. You're absolutely right. The inequity in our education system is inexcusable. He seemed to be considering something. What if we used your situation to help change that? Dr. Chen looked interested. What are you thinking, Judge? The university has a community outreach program, doesn't it? When Dr. Chen nodded, he continued. What if we created a special initiative? We could use Andrew's story to secure funding for technology education in underserved schools, with Andrew helping to design the curriculum. For the first time since his arrest, Andrew felt real hope bubbling up inside him. Not just for himself, but for his friends and the younger kids in his neighborhood who had the same hunger to learn but lacked the resources. "I could help with that," he said, his voice stronger now. "I taught myself by piecing things together, but it shouldn't be that hard. Other kids shouldn't have to sneak into places just to learn." Mr. Wilson cleared his throat. "Judge, there's still one problem. Andrew's mom. She works 2 jobs to keep their apartment. She can't drive him to the university every day." Andrew's face fell. He hadn't even thought about the practical problems. The university was across town, and bus service from his neighborhood was limited. Judge Harrington tapped his fingers thoughtfully on his desk. "Let me make a call." He picked up his phone and dialed a number. "Thomas? Richard Harrington here. Remember that transportation initiative for disadvantaged students we discussed last month? I think I found our perfect test case." After a brief conversation, the judge hung up with a satisfied smile. "The county has a pilot program for educational transportation. They'll provide you with daily rides to and from the university. And," he added, looking at Andra, "they'll also provide a stipend to make up for any part-time job income you might lose while focusing on your studies." Andra couldn't believe what he was hearing. It was like someone had opened a door to a future he only dreamed about. But one worry still nagged at him. "My mom," he started hesitantly. "She doesn't know any of this happened. The arrest, the court, none of it. She was already at work when they picked me up." Judge Harrington checked his watch. "What time does she finish work?" "She has 2 jobs. The hospital cleaning shift ends at 3, then she starts at the convenience store at 4. "I think a home visit is in order," the judge decided. "Dr. Chen, can you join me? I believe Ms. Taylor deserves to hear about her son's exceptional achievements and our plans to support his education, and I'd like to personally explain the misunderstanding about the arrest." Dr. Chen nodded. "I'd be honored, and I can bring the university admission paperwork for her to review." Andrew felt tears pricking his eyes but blinked them back. Everything was happening so fast. Just 24 hours ago, he'd been hunched over a computer in a borrowed space, afraid of being discovered. Now these important people were making plans for his future, treating his ideas as valuable, and even planning to visit his mom. "Thank you," he managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. But he hesitated, not wanting to sound ungrateful. "What is it, Andra?" Mr. Wilson encouraged. "What about the other kids like me? There are others at my school who are really smart but don't have opportunities." The adults exchanged glances, surprised and impressed by his concern for others even in the midst of his own good fortune. Judge Harrington smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his stern face. "That's exactly the kind of thinking that makes you exceptional, Andra. And addressing that will be the next phase of our plan." The apartment building where Andra lived with his mom stood in the shadow of the elevated train tracks. Paint peeled from the walls, and the elevator had an out-of-order sign that looked permanent. Judge Harrington's polished shoes seemed out of place on the cracked linoleum floor as they climbed the stairs to the 4th floor. Andrew led the unusual group, a judge, a university professor, and the security guard, down the narrow hallway. He fumbled with his keys, suddenly nervous about bringing these people into the small apartment he shared with his mom. "It's not much," he mumbled, pushing open the door. The apartment was tiny but spotlessly clean. What it lacked in space and modern furnishings, it made up for in care. Hand-sewn curtains brightened the windows, and family photos covered one wall. A small desk in the corner was piled with library books and notebooks filled with Andrew's careful handwriting. His mom wasn't home yet. Her shift at the hospital would end soon, giving them time to prepare. Dr. Chen walked over to the desk, picking up one of Andrew's notebooks. Her eyes widened as she flipped through pages of complex code written entirely by hand. "You did all this without a computer?" she asked, amazed. Andrew shrugged. "I could only use the library computers for an hour a day. I had to write everything out first so I wouldn't waste time when I got online." Judge Harrington examined the wall of photos. And as a baby, Andrew's elementary school graduation. Andrew with an older woman who must be the grandmother he'd mentioned. "Your mother must be very proud of you," the judge said quietly. She is, Andrew replied. But she doesn't really understand what I do with computers. She just knows I like them. Mr. Wilson chuckled. She's about to learn a lot more. They heard keys in the lock, and everyone turned as the door opened. Andrew's mother stepped in, still wearing her hospital cleaning staff uniform. She froze when she saw the room full of strangers. Andrew? Worry immediately filled her voice. What's happening? Who are these people? Andrew rushed to her side. Mom, it's okay. These people are here to help. This is Dr. Chen from the university, Mr. Wilson who works security there, and, Judge Harrington. His mother's face paled at the word judge. She gripped Andrew's arm. Judge. Andrew, what happened? Aren't you in trouble? Judge Harrington stepped forward. Mrs. Taylor, I can assure you, your son is not in trouble. Quite the opposite, in fact. We're here because Andrew has done something remarkable. Over the next 20 minutes, they explained everything, the late-night computer sessions, the arrest, the court appearance, and most importantly, Andrew's extraordinary talent and the university's offer. Andrew's mother sank onto their worn sofa, overwhelmed. She looked at her son with new eyes. You created a program to help Grandma with her medicine, she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Andrew nodded. I was scared to tell you about sneaking into the university. I didn't want you to worry. She reached for his hand. All those nights you said you were studying at the library, you were actually creating something to help people. Mrs. Taylor, Dr. Chen said gently, your son has created something that could help thousands of people like his grandmother. And he did it with almost no resources or formal training. That kind of talent and determination is extremely rare. Judge Harrington cleared his throat. I also need to apologize to both of you. When Andrew first appeared in my courtroom, I made unfair assumptions. I treated him disrespectfully before I knew the facts. Andrew's mother straightened her shoulders, maternal protectiveness flashing in her eyes. You judged my son because of how he looks and where he comes from. Yes, the judge admitted, not flinching from her direct gaze. I did. And I was completely wrong. That's why I'm here personally, to make amends and to make sure Andrew gets the opportunities he deserves. She studied the judge for a long moment, then nodded slightly, accepting his apology but not forgetting it. Now, Dr. Chen said, breaking the tension, we need to discuss practical matters. She pulled out university paperwork. This is a special admission offer for Andrew with a full scholarship. It includes access to all university facilities, a stipend for living expenses, and one-on-one mentoring with our faculty. Andrew's mother's eyes filled with tears. But he hasn't finished high school yet. We've arranged for him to complete his high school requirements while beginning university courses, the judge explained. And transportation will be provided daily. Andrew watched his mother's face as the reality sank in. College had always been a distant dream, something they couldn't afford to even think about. Now it was being handed to them. His mother wiped her eyes. I always knew my boy was special. Even when he was little, the way he figured things out. Her voice caught. But no one else ever seemed to notice. Mr. Wilson smiled kindly. We've noticed now, Mrs. Taylor. She looked at her son with fierce pride. You did this, Andrew. All those nights studying, all those hours teaching yourself. You did this. Andrew felt a lump in his throat. I just wanted to help people like Grandma. Judge Harrington cleared his throat again. There's one more thing. Andrew expressed concern about other talented students at his school who lack opportunities. We're launching an initiative to improve technology education in underserved schools, and we'd like Andrew to help design it. Andrew's face lit up. Really? You mean like computer labs and coding classes for my school? Dr. Chen nodded. Exactly. And not just your school. We want to use what happened here as a catalyst for system-wide change. Andrew's mother squeezed his hand. Your father would be so proud, she whispered, mentioning the dad Andrew had lost when he was just 7 years old. As the adults discussed details, Andrew slipped away to the window, looking out at the neighborhood where he'd grown up. Kids played basketball with a bent rim on the court below. An old man fixed a car that had seen better days. A group of younger children compared trading cards on a stoop. How many of them had talents and dreams that no one had discovered yet? How many of them just needed one person to see past appearances and assumptions? For the first time, Andrew realized that his story could be more than just about his own success. It could open doors for others too. 6 months passed in a whirlwind of change. The courtroom where Andrew had once stood humiliated was now filled with a different kind of energy. Colorful banners hung from the walls, and rows of shiny new laptops lined tables at the front. Today, the space wasn't being used for trials, but for the official launch of the Hidden Genius program. Andrew stood at the podium, no longer the nervous boy who couldn't meet anyone's eyes. At 17, he'd grown an inch taller and carried himself with quiet confidence. He adjusted the microphone and looked out at the crowd of students, teachers, community leaders, and news cameras. 6 months ago, I was arrested for trying to learn, he began, his voice steady. Today, we're making sure no other kid has to go to those extremes just to get access to technology. The audience applauded. In the front row, Andrew's mother dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Beside her sat his grandmother, proudly wearing her Sunday best, her medication organized in a special pill box that used Andrew's app to remind her when to take each dose. Dr. Chen beamed from her seat next to the university president. Over the past months, she had become Andrew's mentor, guiding his extraordinary talent while learning from his unique perspective. What had started as Andrew's simple program for his grandmother had evolved into a sophisticated health literacy platform that was now being tested in 3 local hospitals. Judge Harrington sat nearby, looking remarkably different from the stern figure who had once mocked Andrew from the bench. Working with Andrew had changed him. He had become a vocal advocate for educational equity and second chances for youth. The Hidden Genius program will bring computer science labs to every school in our district, Andrew continued. But it's not just about computers. It's about seeing potential in every student, regardless of where they come from or how they look. He gestured to a group of teens seated together, students he had personally recruited from his old high school. Each had shown promise in math or science, but lacked resources to develop their talents. These are just a few of the brilliant minds in our community, Andrew said proudly. Lisa created an algorithm that helps predict water main breaks before they happen. Dwayne designed an app that connects elderly residents with teenage helpers for household tasks. Tyler is developing a system that converts food waste from school cafeterias into compost for community gardens. The audience clapped for each student, who stood briefly, many looking surprised by the recognition they'd never received before. None of this would have happened without second chances and people willing to look beyond their first impressions, Andrew said, glancing at Judge Harrington. And it definitely wouldn't have happened if people like Mr. Wilson hadn't been willing to bend the rules a little to help a kid with a dream. Mr. Wilson chuckled from his seat. He had become something of a grandfather figure to Andrew, often bringing homemade cookies to the computer lab where Andrew now worked legally. Today, we're not just launching computer labs, Andrew continued. We're launching a mentorship program pairing these students with professionals in their fields of interest. We're creating scholarships for college. And we're changing the way our community sees its young people. Judge Harrington approached the podium when Andrew finished, shaking his hand with genuine respect. When Andrew first stood in my courtroom, I saw only what I expected to see, another kid in trouble, the judge admitted to the audience. I couldn't have been more wrong. It taught me that justice isn't just about applying the law. It's about truly seeing the person standing before you. He turned to Andrew. You've taught this old judge more than I ever thought I had left to learn. After the ceremony, as people mingled and explored the new laptops, a small boy around 10 years old approached Andrew. Is it true? The boy asked, eyes wide. You taught yourself all that computer stuff without even having a computer. Andrew knelt down to the boy's level. I did. I had to write everything out by hand first. I like math and science, the boy said shyly. But my teacher says I talk too much and ask too many questions. Andrew smiled. The best scientists ask lots of questions. What's your name? David. Well, David, do you want to see something cool? Andrew led him to one of the laptops and opened a simple coding program he had designed for beginners. Try this. It's like a puzzle, but you get to make the rules. As David began to explore, his face lighting up with each discovery, Andrew's mother came to stand beside her son. Look at you, she said softly, teaching the next generation already. Andrew watched David figure out a coding problem faster than most adults would have. There are so many kids like him out there, Mom, like I was. They just need someone to notice. Across the room, Judge Harrington was deep in conversation with the superintendent of schools. Dr. Chen was showing Andrew's grandmother how the medical app worked on her new tablet, a gift from the university. Andrew's phone buzzed with a message from the research team at the hospital. The first trial of his medical translation program had shown a 62% improvement in medication adherence among patients with limited English proficiency or low literacy. He looked around the room, at David exploring the coding program, at his former classmates proudly demonstrating their projects, at the adults who had come together to create this opportunity, and at his mother who had always believed in him even when she didn't understand what he was doing. 6 months ago, he had been a frightened boy in handcuffs. Now he was part of something bigger than himself, a movement to find and nurture hidden talents in overlooked places. You know what the best part is? Andrew said to his mother, watching David solve another coding puzzle with ease. What's that, baby? That kid will never know what it feels like to be invisible. He'll never have to break rules just to learn. Andrew smiled as David called him over excitedly to show what he'd created. And neither will any other kid in our neighborhood, not anymore. As Andrew walked over to see David's work, Judge Harrington watched from across the room. The judge who had once mocked a quiet black teen now saw the future unfolding before him, a future made brighter by the very person he had nearly dismissed and by all the hidden geniuses yet to be discovered.